Sometimes the most extraordinary moments in life begin with the most ordinary people doing something they never thought possible. When Margaret and Thomas Collins received an elegant cream envelope bearing the royal seal, their hands trembled, not from excitement, but from disbelief. Their daughter Catherine, once a shy girl from a small Yorkshire town who struggled to speak in front of her school class, was being honored at Westminster Abbey for her groundbreaking work in children's literacy programs across underprivileged communities. This wasn't just any ceremony. This was Westminster Abbey, where kings and queens have been crowned for nearly 1,000 years, where the greatest minds and most noble hearts in British history have been celebrated. And somehow, their Catherine, their little girl who used to hide behind Margaret's skirts when strangers came to visit, would be standing before the Archbishop of Canterbury receiving recognition that would change not just her life but the lives of thousands of children she had touched. But this story isn't really about Catherine's achievement. It's about two parents who, despite their own fears and insecurities, chose to step out of their comfort zone and into a world they never belonged to. Because love doesn't know boundaries, and sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply showing up for the people who matter most. Margaret Collins stood in front of her wardrobe, staring at clothes that suddenly seemed inadequate for the most important day of her life. The cream-colored invitation lay on her dresser, its gold-embossed letters catching the morning light that filtered through the lace curtains of their modest Yorkshire home. Westminster Abbey. The words still seemed impossible, like something from a dream she might have had after watching too much television. "Tom," she called to her husband, who was downstairs making his third cup of tea since breakfast. "What does one wear to Westminster Abbey when your daughter is being honored by the Archbishop himself?" Thomas Collins paused, his weathered hands wrapped around the familiar blue mug that had seen him through 30 years of early morning shifts at the textile mill. He had been asking himself the same question, though his version was more along the lines of how a man who had never owned a suit that cost more than £50 was supposed to present himself in the most sacred building in England. The journey to this moment had begun 18 months earlier, when Catherine had called them with news that initially seemed too fantastic to believe. Their daughter, who had left their small town of Millbridge 15 years ago with nothing but a teaching degree and an old suitcase, had been selected to lead a revolutionary literacy program that was transforming education in some of London's most challenging neighborhoods. Margaret remembered that phone call with perfect clarity. Catherine's voice had been different, filled with an excitement and purpose that reminded Margaret of the little girl who used to line up her dolls and teach them to read using picture books from the local library. "Mum, you won't believe what's happened," Catherine had said, her words tumbling over each other in her enthusiasm. "The program we started in Southwark, it's working." "Really working. Children who couldn't read a single word 6 months ago are now reading entire books. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, he wants to meet with me. He's heard about what we're doing. And..." Margaret had sat down heavily in her kitchen chair, the one with the slightly wobbly leg that Tom kept meaning to fix. The Archbishop of Canterbury. She knew enough about the Church of England to understand that this was significant, though the full magnitude wouldn't hit her until later. Over the following months, Catherine's updates had become increasingly surreal. Meetings with education ministers, invitations to Lambeth Palace, requests for interviews from national newspapers. Their quiet, bookish daughter was becoming someone important, someone whose work mattered on a scale that neither Margaret nor Tom could fully comprehend. The literacy program that had started Catherine's remarkable journey was born from her own childhood experience. Growing up in Millbridge, she had witnessed firsthand how children from working-class families often fell behind in school, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked resources and support. Her parents, despite their limited education, had instilled in her a love of reading by taking her to the library every Saturday morning, a ritual that continued until she left for university. When Catherine moved to London and began teaching in Southwark, she was shocked by the number of children who arrived at secondary school, unable to read properly. These weren't children with learning disabilities or special needs. They were bright, curious young people who had simply been failed by a system that didn't know how to reach them. Her solution was elegantly simple. Instead of trying to fix the system from within, she would create something entirely new. Working evenings and weekends, Catherine began visiting the homes of struggling students, not to lecture parents about the importance of education, but to understand the barriers that prevented children from learning. What she discovered was that many parents wanted desperately to help their children, but felt intimidated by schools and teachers who seemed to speak a different language. Some parents had their own literacy struggles and were embarrassed to admit it. Others worked multiple jobs and simply didn't have time to sit with their children and help with homework. Catherine's breakthrough came when she realized that the solution wasn't to change the parents or the children, but to change the approach. She began training older students to become reading mentors for younger ones, creating a peer-to-peer network that made learning feel less formal and more like play. She also started family reading circles where parents and children learned together, removing the stigma and creating shared experiences around books and stories. The results were immediate and dramatic. Children who had been labeled as behind or struggling began to flourish. Reading scores improved, but more importantly, attitudes toward learning transformed. Parents who had felt disconnected from their children's education became active partners in their academic success. Word of Catherine's program spread through the complex networks of South London communities. Other schools began requesting her help. Local council members took notice. Eventually, her work caught the attention of educational researchers at King's College London, who wanted to study her methods and understand why they were so effective. Margaret and Tom had followed these developments with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. They were immensely proud of their daughter, of course, but they struggled to understand how the little girl they had raised in their small town had become someone whose work was being discussed in Parliament and written about in the Times. The invitation to Westminster Abbey represented the culmination of Catherine's efforts. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, had decided to create a special ceremony to honor individuals whose work embodied the Christian values of service and compassion. Catherine's literacy program, which had now expanded to 12 boroughs across London and was being replicated in cities throughout England, was exactly the kind of grassroots community work that the church wanted to celebrate.
When Catherine called to tell them about the invitation, Margaret had initially assumed she meant they should watch the ceremony on television.
The idea that they would actually attend, that they would sit in Westminster Abbey and watch their daughter receive this honor in person, seemed beyond the realm of possibility.
"Of course you'll be there," Catherine had said when Margaret expressed her doubts.
"You're the reason any of this is happening. Do you think I would have learned to love reading if you hadn't taken me to the library every week?
You think I would have understood the importance of supporting children if I hadn't watched you and Dad sacrifice for my education?"
Margaret had started crying then, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming sense of gratitude and disbelief. How had she and Tom, two people who had left school at 16 and worked with their hands their entire lives, raised a daughter who was changing the world? The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Catherine had insisted on paying for their accommodations in London and had even arranged for them to have new clothes for the ceremony. Margaret had initially resisted, but Catherine was adamant. "This isn't charity, Mom," she had said firmly. "This is your daughter wanting to make sure her parents feel as special as they are. You raised me to believe that everyone deserves dignity and respect regardless of their background. This is the book, it's about history. This is the book, it's about history. This is the book, it's about history. Well, that includes you and Dad." The shopping trip to York had been an adventure in itself. Margaret had never owned a dress that cost more than £30, and the idea of spending hundreds on an outfit she would wear once seemed almost sinful. But the saleswoman at the department store had been kind and patient, helping her find a navy dress with a matching jacket that made her feel elegant without feeling like she was wearing a costume. Tom's experience had been similar.
The young man at the men's store had treated him with respect and care, measuring him for a proper suit and explaining the difference between various styles and fabrics. Tom had been surprised to discover that he actually enjoyed the process, that there was something satisfying about wearing clothes that fit perfectly and made him feel confident.
As the day of the ceremony approached, Margaret found herself experiencing a range of emotions she couldn't quite name. There was pride, certainly, but also anxiety about whether she and Tom would fit in among the other guests.
There was excitement about seeing Catherine honored, but also a strange sadness about how much their daughter had outgrown the small world where she had been raised. The night before they were to leave for London, Margaret sat in Catherine's old bedroom, looking at the bookshelves that still held her childhood favorites. The room had been preserved exactly as Catherine had left it when she went to university, down to the faded poster of the periodic table and the collection of certificates from school reading competitions. Margaret picked up a worn copy of The Secret Garden, remembering how Catherine had insisted on reading it aloud to her parents when she was 10 years old, even though they had already read it together several times. She had been so determined that they should love the story as much as she did, so eager to share the magic she found in books. That little girl, Margaret realized, was still there in the woman who had devoted her life to helping other children discover that same magic. The scale had changed, the setting was grander, but the heart of what Catherine was doing remained the same. She was still the child who believed that everyone deserved to experience the joy of reading, who understood instinctively that books could open doors to worlds beyond imagination. Tom found her there an hour later, still holding the book and lost in memories. Ready for tomorrow? He asked, settling beside her on Catherine's narrow single bed. Margaret considered the question seriously.
Was she ready to sit in Westminster Abbey, surrounded by people whose names she recognized from newspapers and television? Was she ready to watch her daughter receive an honor that would place her among the most respected educators in the country?
Was she ready to step into a world where she would always feel like an outsider?
No, she said honestly.
I don't think I'll ever be ready for something like this, but I'm going anyway because Catherine needs us there. And maybe that's what love is sometimes, showing up even when you're not ready. Tom nodded, understanding completely.
Tomorrow they would leave the comfortable familiarity of their small town and enter a world that seemed designed for people unlike them. But they would do it because their daughter had asked them to. Because 18 months of watching Catherine's work unfold had taught them that the most important things in life often happen outside of our comfort zones.
The last thing Margaret did before going to bed was to pack the cream invitation carefully in her handbag, next to her reading glasses and the small notebook where she kept important phone numbers. Tomorrow she and Tom would walk into Westminster Abbey not as tourists or curiosity seekers, but as the parents of someone who was making a difference in the world.
As she turned off the light in Catherine's room, Margaret whispered a small prayer of gratitude. For the daughter who had exceeded every dream they had ever dared to have. For the unexpected journey that had brought them to this moment, and for the reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the most ordinary acts of love. The train journey from Yorkshire to London felt both endless and impossibly short. Margaret Collins sat by the window, watching the familiar countryside give way to increasingly urban landscapes, each mile taking her further from everything she had ever known and closer to something that still felt like someone else's life. Thomas sat beside her, unusually quiet, his hands smoothing the fabric of his new trousers with unconscious nervousness. They had left Millbridge at dawn, their neighbors gathering at the garden gate to see them off as if they were departing for a foreign country. In many ways, Margaret thought, they were. The overnight bag at her feet contained items that seemed almost comically formal for a woman who typically lived in comfortable cardigans and sensible shoes. The navy dress Catherine had helped her choose hung carefully in a garment bag, along with matching shoes that had required 2 weeks of breaking in around the house.
More intimidating than the clothes was the small clutch purse that contained their printed invitations, hotel confirmation, and a London Underground map that Catherine had annotated with careful instructions.
As the train pulled into King's Cross Station, Margaret felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety.
London had always seemed impossibly large and intimidating from the safety of Yorkshire. The few times she and Tom had visited Catherine in her early teaching years, they had rarely ventured beyond her small flat in Elephant and Castle, content to let their daughter guide them through the maze of streets and underground stations. This time was different. This time they needed to navigate the city independently, to present themselves at places where their presence would be noted and judged.
Margaret had studied the tube map so intently that she could probably recite the stations from King's Cross to Westminster, but memorizing routes and actually traveling them were entirely different challenges. Right then, Tom said, hefting their weekend bag as passengers streamed around them on the platform.
Catherine said to take the Metropolitan line to Baker Street, then change to the Jubilee line toward London Bridge, getting off at Westminster.
Margaret nodded, though the instructions felt foreign in her mouth. At home in Millbridge, directions were simple things. Past the church, left at the post office, down the lane where the Hendersons used to live.
Here, navigation required understanding colored lines and numbered zones, required confidence to push through crowds of commuters who moved with the purposeful speed of people who belonged. Their hotel was a modest but clean establishment near Victoria Station that Catherine had selected specifically because it was walking distance from Westminster Abbey. As they checked in, Margaret noticed how the young woman at reception automatically assumed they were tourists visiting London for the usual reasons, offering brochures for the Tower of London and Buckingham Palace tours. Actually, Margaret found herself saying with unexpected pride, "We're here for the ceremony at Westminster Abbey tomorrow. Our daughter is being honored by the Archbishop of Canterbury." The receptionist's expression changed immediately, shifting from polite professionalism to genuine interest.
How wonderful. What an honor for your family.
I do hope you have a memorable experience. It was a small moment, but it meant something to Margaret.
For the first time since receiving the invitation, she felt less like an imposter and more like someone who had every right to be here.
Their room was small but comfortable, with a view of the street below where black cabs and red buses created a constant stream of movement. Margaret unpacked their few belongings carefully, hanging up their formal clothes and arranging their toiletries in the tiny bathroom. The routine activities helped calm her nerves, providing familiar tasks in an unfamiliar environment. Catherine had arranged to meet them for dinner that evening at a restaurant near their hotel. Margaret had been looking forward to seeing her daughter for weeks, but she was also nervous about how Catherine would appear to them now, in her own environment, surrounded by the life she had built so far from Yorkshire. The restaurant Catherine had chosen was neither too fancy nor too casual, a thoughtful compromise that immediately put Margaret at ease. When Catherine arrived, slightly out of breath from rushing across London after a full day of meetings, she looked exactly like the daughter Margaret remembered, warm, genuine, and slightly overwhelmed by her own life. "I can't believe this is actually happening," Catherine said as she hugged her parents, holding on perhaps a moment longer than usual. "I keep thinking someone is going to realize there's been a mistake and tell me the invitation was meant for someone else." Tom laughed, the first genuinely relaxed sound he had made all day. "That's exactly what your mother said when we opened the envelope. I told her if they made a mistake, they picked the right mistake." Over dinner, Catherine told them about the past few months of preparation for the ceremony. The meetings with church officials, the coordination with other honorees, the media attention that had been both gratifying and overwhelming. Margaret listened with growing amazement as her daughter described conference calls with education ministers and interviews with journalists from national newspapers. "The strangest part," Catherine admitted, "is how everyone keeps talking about my vision and my innovative approach, as if I planned all of this from the beginning. The truth is, I just saw children who needed help and tried to figure out how to help them." Everything else grew from there. Margaret recognized her daughter in that statement. Catherine had always been someone who saw problems as puzzles to be solved, rather than obstacles to be endured. Even as a child, she had approached challenges with a combination of determination and creativity that had often surprised her parents. The conversation gradually shifted to more practical matters. Catherine explained what would happen the next day, walking them through the schedule with the kind of careful detail that revealed her own nervousness beneath her composed exterior. "We'll need to arrive at the Abbey by 9:30, she said, consulting notes she had written on her phone. "The ceremony begins at 11, but there's a reception beforehand where you'll meet some of the other families. The Archbishop will speak with each honoree individually before the formal ceremony begins." Margaret tried to imagine making conversation with strangers at a reception in Westminster Abbey. The very idea seemed surreal, like something from a movie rather than her actual life. But Catherine's obvious excitement was contagious, and Margaret found herself looking forward to the experience despite her apprehensions. As they walked back to the hotel through the London evening, Catherine pointed out landmarks and shared stories about her life in the city. She showed them the bus route she took to her first teaching job, the park where she went running on weekend mornings, the bookshop where she had discovered many of the titles she now used in her literacy program. "I love London," she said as they paused outside the hotel. "But I need you to know that everything good about what I do here comes from what you taught me at home. The belief that everyone deserves respect and opportunity, the understanding that small acts of kindness can change lives, the conviction that education is the most powerful tool we have for creating a better world." None of that came from university or teaching college. It came from watching how you lived your lives. That night, Margaret lay in the narrow hotel bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of London traffic and thinking about Catherine's words. She had never considered herself a teacher, but she realized that she and Tom had been educating their daughter every day of her childhood through their actions and values rather than their words. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of October day that made London look its most beautiful. Margaret woke early, too nervous and excited to sleep, and spent extra time on her appearance. The navy dress fit perfectly, and the matching jacket gave her a sense of dignity and purpose that she hoped would carry her through the day ahead. Tom, who had been quietly anxious about wearing a suit that cost more than his monthly car payment, looked distinguished and handsome in his new clothes. Margaret felt a surge of pride as she watched him adjust his tie with the careful precision he brought to everything he did. They met Catherine in the hotel lobby, where she was waiting with obvious excitement and barely controlled nerves. She looked beautiful in a deep green dress that complemented her auburn hair, professional but not severe, confident but not arrogant. Looking at her, Margaret felt the same mixture of pride and wonder that had overwhelmed her when Catherine had graduated from university 15 years earlier. The short walk to Westminster Abbey felt like a pilgrimage. With each step, the massive Gothic structure grew larger and more imposing, its twin towers reaching toward a sky that seemed impossibly high and blue. Margaret had seen photographs of the Abbey countless times, but nothing had prepared her for the physical reality of its presence, the way it seemed to dwarf everything around it while simultaneously inviting people to enter and be transformed. Other families were walking toward the Abbey with the same mixture of anticipation and nervousness that Margaret felt. She recognized the expression on other parents' faces, the look of people who found themselves in circumstances they had never imagined but were determined to rise to the occasion. At the entrance, volunteers with clipboards checked invitations and directed families toward different areas. Margaret noticed how naturally Catherine interacted with the church officials, how she had learned to move through formal situations with grace and confidence.
This version of her daughter, comfortable in settings that would have intimidated the younger Catherine, was both familiar and surprising. The reception was held in a side chapel that was itself larger and more ornate than any building Margaret had ever entered for a social gathering.
Stained glass windows cast colored light across stone floors that had been worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The scale was magnificent but not overwhelming, grand but somehow intimate. Margaret found herself in conversation with other parents whose children were being honored that day. There was the mother of a young doctor who had pioneered mobile health clinics for homeless populations, the father of an engineer who had developed water purification systems for refugee camps, the grandmother of a social worker who had created support networks for elderly people living in isolation.
What struck Margaret was how ordinary these families seemed, how much they had in common despite their different backgrounds and circumstances. They were all people who had raised children with strong moral convictions, who had somehow instilled values of service and compassion that had led to remarkable achievements. They were proof that extraordinary contributions to society could emerge from the most humble beginnings. As the formal ceremony approached, Margaret felt her nervousness transform into something deeper and more powerful.
This wasn't just about Catherine's individual achievement. It was about the recognition that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they were guided by love and supported by family and community. The processional into the main sanctuary was breathtaking. Margaret had attended church services all her life, but nothing had prepared her for the majesty of Westminster Abbey in full ceremonial mode. The soaring arches, the intricate stone carvings, the sense of standing in a place where history had been made for nearly 1,000 years all combined to create an atmosphere that was both humbling and inspiring.
As she took her seat in the section reserved for families, Margaret looked around at the other guests and realized that she belonged here as much as anyone else. Not because of her social status or her education or her wealth, but because of her fundamental humanity and her role in raising a daughter who was making the world a better place. When Catherine's name was called and she walked toward the altar, Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. This was the little girl who had once been too shy to read aloud in school, the teenager who had worried that she wasn't smart enough for university, the young woman who had doubted whether she could make a difference in the world.
And here she was, being honored in the most sacred space in England for work that was changing thousands of lives. The Archbishop's words about Catherine's program were eloquent and moving. But what touched Margaret most deeply was the simple recognition that her daughter had chosen to dedicate her life to helping others, particularly children who faced the same kinds of barriers that Catherine herself had once encountered.
The ceremony was beautiful, but the real beauty lay in the understanding that this recognition represented not an end but a beginning, not a conclusion but an encouragement to continue the work that mattered most. The moments immediately following the ceremony felt suspended in time, as if the magnitude of what had just occurred required a pause for the world to readjust itself around this new reality.
Margaret Collins sat in her pew in Westminster Abbey, watching as Catherine received congratulations from the Archbishop of Canterbury, and tried to process the transformation she had just witnessed. Her daughter, the same girl who had once hidden behind Margaret's skirt when meeting new people, had just stood before one of the most powerful religious figures in England and accepted recognition for work that was reshaping educational policy across the country.
The contrast between the shy child Margaret remembered and the confident woman she was watching seemed almost impossible to reconcile. As the formal ceremony concluded and guests began to move toward the reception area, Margaret found herself approached by a woman in her 60s, wearing an elegant gray suit and a warm smile.
"You must be Catherine's mother," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Diana Worthington. My son James runs the water purification program for refugee camps that was also honored today. I wanted to tell you how much Catherine's work has meant to our family." Margaret looked puzzled, wondering how Catherine's literacy program could have connected with humanitarian work overseas. Diana seemed to understand her confusion and explained with the kind of patience that suggested she was used to making complex connections clear to others. "James struggled with reading when he was young," Diana continued. "He was bright, but the traditional teaching methods just didn't work for him." When he heard about Catherine's peer mentoring approach,
He adapted it for his work with refugee children. Many of these children have had their education disrupted by war and displacement, and Catherine's methods have been revolutionary in helping them catch up academically, while also processing their trauma through storytelling and shared reading experiences. This was the first time Margaret had heard that Catherine's work was being used in international contexts, and the revelation added another layer to her growing understanding of her daughter's impact. What had started as a local solution to a neighborhood problem had somehow evolved into something with global applications.
As they moved through the reception, Margaret encountered more people whose lives had been touched by Catherine's work in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. There was a head teacher from Birmingham who had implemented Catherine's family reading circles in her school and seen dramatic improvements not just in literacy rates, but in parent engagement and community cohesion.
There was a university researcher who was writing a book about innovative educational approaches and had dedicated an entire chapter to Catherine's methods. Most moving of all was meeting Sarah Peterson, a young woman who introduced herself as one of Catherine's first peer mentors from the Southwark program.
Sarah was now studying at the London School of Economics, pursuing a degree in education policy, and she credited Catherine with changing the entire trajectory of her life.
I was 14 when Miss Catherine started the program, Sarah explained to Margaret and Tom.
I was smart enough, but I hated school, and I was heading toward dropping out entirely. She paired me with a girl named Aisha who was struggling with basic reading, and suddenly I had a purpose. Teaching Aisha made me realize that I was actually good at something important. Sarah's story illuminated aspects of Catherine's work that Margaret had never fully understood.
The peer mentoring program wasn't just helping struggling students. It was also identifying and developing leadership potential in older students who might otherwise have been overlooked by traditional educational systems. The most amazing thing about Miss Catherine, Sarah continued, is that she never made anyone feel stupid or ashamed.
She had this way of making you understand that everyone learns differently, and that the goal wasn't to fix people, but to find approaches that worked for each individual. That philosophy changed everything for me.
As Margaret listened to Sarah and others describe Catherine's impact, she began to understand that her daughter had accomplished something far more significant than she had initially realized. Catherine hadn't just created a successful literacy program. She had developed a new way of thinking about education that honored the dignity and potential of every learner. The formal reception eventually gave way to smaller, more intimate conversations. Catherine finally had a chance to spend time with her parents, and the three of them found a quiet corner where they could talk without interruption.
I still can't believe this actually happened, Catherine said, looking around at the Gothic splendor surrounding them.
6 months ago, I was just a teacher trying to help kids in South London. Now I'm here, in Westminster Abbey, being treated like I've done something historically significant. Tom, who had been largely quiet throughout the day, taking everything in with his characteristic thoughtful observation, finally spoke up. The thing is, Catherine, you have done something historically significant, not because of this ceremony or this recognition, but because you've changed how people think about learning and community. Those children Sarah talked about, they're going to grow up and change other people's lives. The parents who learn to read alongside their children in your family circles, they're going to support their children's education in ways their own parents never could.
This ceremony is just recognizing something that was already true.
Catherine's eyes filled with tears, and Margaret realized that for all her professional success and public recognition, their daughter still needed to hear that her parents understood and valued what she had accomplished.
The ceremony at Westminster Abbey was meaningful, but the approval and pride of the people who had raised her remained the validation that mattered most. As the afternoon continued, Margaret found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment.
The path from Catherine's childhood in Millbridge to this recognition at Westminster Abbey hadn't been straight or predictable. There had been moments of doubt, periods of financial struggle, and times when Catherine had questioned whether she was making the right choices. Margaret remembered the phone call 3 years earlier when Catherine had been offered a position with significantly higher pay at a private school in North London. The job would have provided financial security and professional prestige, but it would have meant leaving the community work that had become her passion.
I don't know what to do, Mum, Catherine had said during one of their weekly phone conversations. The practical side of me says I should take the job.
I could pay off my student loans, save money for a house deposit, have the kind of life that looks successful from the outside, but I keep thinking about the children in Southwark, about the programs we're just beginning to see results from. How can I walk away from work that's actually making a difference to pursue work that just pays better. Margaret's advice had been simple. Follow your heart, but use your head too. Ask yourself which choice you'll be prouder of in 20 years' time.
Catherine had stayed in Southwark, accepting the financial uncertainty in favor of continuing work that aligned with her values. That decision had led directly to the expansion of her program, the research collaborations, and ultimately to this recognition at Westminster Abbey.
Looking back, Margaret could see how every choice Catherine had made, even the ones that had seemed risky or impractical at the time, had been guided by a consistent set of principles about service, community, and the transformative power of education. These weren't principles Catherine had learned in university or teacher training. They were values she had absorbed during childhood in Millbridge, watching her parents live lives of quiet integrity and community service. As the reception began to wind down, Margaret found herself in conversation with the Archbishop of Canterbury himself. She had been nervous about this possibility, uncertain what one said to such an important religious figure, but Archbishop Welby proved to be remarkably down-to-earth and genuinely interested in learning about Catherine's background and upbringing.
"I'm fascinated by the family and community influences that shape people like your daughter," he said. "Catherine's approach to education is fundamentally about seeing the sacred potential in every child and creating conditions where that potential can flourish. Those aren't insights that come from textbooks. They come from being raised by people who understand the inherent worth and dignity of every human being." The Archbishop's words helped Margaret understand that what was being celebrated that day wasn't just Catherine's professional achievement, but the values-based approach to living that she had learned at home and carried into her work. The ceremony was recognizing not just what Catherine had done, but who she was and how she had chosen to use her talents in service of others. As they prepared to leave Westminster Abbey, Margaret took one last look around the magnificent space where they had spent the afternoon. The Gothic arches, the intricate stonework, the stained glass windows that had witnessed nearly a millennium of British history all seemed to be offering their blessing to the work Catherine was doing and the family that had supported her journey.
The train ride back to Yorkshire the next morning was filled with quiet reflection and processing. Margaret and Tom had decided to extend their stay in London by one night, partly to spend more time with Catherine, but mostly to allow themselves time to absorb what they had experienced. They had walked through Hyde Park, visited the British Museum, and eaten dinner at a restaurant that Catherine insisted was one of London's best-kept secrets. But mostly they had talked, sharing memories and observations about the ceremony and what it meant for Catherine's future and their family's story. The most significant realization for Margaret was understanding that the recognition Catherine had received at Westminster Abbey wasn't an endpoint, but a beginning.
The platform and visibility that came with this honor would allow Catherine to expand her work, to influence policy at higher levels, and to mentor other educators who wanted to implement similar approaches in their own communities. As their train pulled into Millbridge Station, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion and continuity.
They were returning to the same small Yorkshire town where Catherine's journey had begun, but they were bringing with them a deeper understanding of how individual actions, guided by strong values and supported by loving families, could ripple outward to create change on a national and even international scale. The neighbors who had gathered to see them off were waiting at the garden gate to hear about their adventure.
As Margaret and Tom shared stories about Westminster Abbey, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Catherine's recognition, they were really sharing a larger story about the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. The cream-colored invitation from Westminster Abbey took its place in the family photo album next to pictures of Catherine's graduation, her first teaching job, and all the other milestones that had marked her journey from shy child to nationally recognized educator.
But the real treasure Margaret brought home wasn't the formal recognition or even the memories of the magnificent ceremony. The real treasure was the confirmation that the values she and Tom had tried to instill in their daughter, the belief in service and community and the transformative power of education, had taken root and flourished in ways that exceeded their wildest dreams.
Catherine's success wasn't separate from her upbringing in Millbridge. It was the direct result of it.
As Margaret unpacked their weekend bag and returned her navy dress to the wardrobe, she smiled at the realization that the most important part of their Westminster Abbey experience wasn't what had happened in that historic building, but what it had taught them about the ongoing power of family, values, and community to shape individual lives in ways that ultimately benefit the entire world. The phone rang that evening, and it was Catherine, calling for their regular weekly conversation.
But this time, the conversation was different. This time, it was filled with plans for the future, dreams for expanding the literacy program, and excitement about the opportunities that lay ahead.
and Margaret knew that whatever challenges or successes the future might bring, Catherine would meet them with the same combination of courage, compassion, and commitment that had brought her to Westminster Abbey in the first place. The circle was complete, but the story was just beginning.